Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. I want to thank
Awesome.
everyone for joining. Um, Kassy, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so
No,
excited to
happy
have
to
you,
be here. Thank you for inviting me.
of course. So before we start our conversation, I'm going to do, for those of you that are joining us, thank you for joining us for the SBJ IC Talks. We're the international community with the Society of Professional Journalists. And our goal really is to connect the community with journalists, with one another. And we want to bring conversations to you, the one-on-one experience. And so we're hoping that you're able to learn and grow from these conversations and take away tools and tips that are going to help you with your work going forward. And so a few things we want to kind of let you guys know is we're doing a webinar format. And so with the webinar format, as you can see, we have a Q&A section and a chat section. So the Q&A section, if you can, please direct questions to Kassy. We have my co-chair, Dan Kubisky, on the call, and he's going to be moderating the questions and letting me know to make sure we ask Kassy these questions. And if you raise your hand, there's a symbol where you can raise your hand. Dan will let me know, and you can directly connect with Kassy, and you can ask her, and or I can ask them for you. Also, the other section that we have, the chat, make sure if there's any technical glitches or something that you want Dan or I to handle, please make sure to put those in the chat section. And yes, and so I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. I'm so excited. So Kassy is an award-winning journalist and audience and social strategist, pioneering an Instagram-first approach to growing young audiences. So she was previously an audience development editor at Bloomberg Quick Take and BuzzFeed News, where she single-handedly made the BuzzFeed World account on Instagram the fastest growing news account on Instagram in 2018. She's been developing, producing, and distributing every single piece of content on that platform, and she organically grew the account from 50,000 followers to more than 785,000 followers in just over a year. Her work at the Account with World led her to partnerships with Instagram for International Women's Day in 2019, and she was awarded both the Silver and People's Choice Levy Award in 2019 for Best Use of Stories for her Woman Crush Wednesday, Badass Woman You Should Know About, and the story series For World. Kassy is also known for her reporting on tech and online culture in Asia Pacific, and is credited with popularizing Chinese memes such as Karma's a Bitch and the 4-Generation Challenge. So she serves as a content strategist for Amnesty International and Flow Health, and we are so excited to have you here. I'm super excited to have you here.
I'm excited
Thank you
to
for
be.
joining us, Kassy.
Thank you again.
So that's a very, I mean, your background and your history with social media and digital strategy, it's very impressive. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got into going into doing more social strategy and doing more of the social media work when it comes to journalism?
Yeah, definitely. So when I first moved to London, which is where I'm based now, so hence the really low lighting, it's like 10 p.m. here. But when I first moved to London, I joined BuzzFeed as a global news reporter slash producer. And so our team was really special in that we were just a small team of 3 people that later expanded to 4 people, but we were just kind of tasked with coming up with, we were supposed to stay 6 months ahead of the newsroom and kind of just experiment with different kind of new formats and new ways of doing things, and then figure out ways that could work and then or didn't work, and things that worked and didn't work, and then figure out ways that we can then inform the newsroom and have them follow us within like the next 6 months. And so I was hired at first as someone to focus on news video and how we could use news video to kind of tell these global news stories that and kind of, because American news tends to dominate the news cycle a lot, so our whole job was to kind of think about ways that we can make these important global news stories that were also really important going on around the world kind of go viral the same way that American news and like Trump tweets kind of like dominate the news cycle. And so a lot of what we did was kind of experiment with different ways that we could use video to tell news stories. So we would travel to different countries all around the world, like Brazil and South Korea and like Europe, or all around Europe, to kind of try and cover these massive breaking news events. So for example, we went to like Barcelona during the Catalonian independence referendum when they voted to declare independence. And then there was also like when we went to Brazil for the elections and South Korea for the Olympics. And we would focus on this like multi-platform approach of kind of covering the like global news stories all around the world, but also covering them with different sorts of, I guess, different mediums. So we would go from, we would do like articles, we would do long form videos, short social news videos, live streams, live tweets, social, native things like tweeting and Instagram stories. And then also like thinking very like multi-platform about all of this. And so that was what we did that's why I did for like a year and a half, kind of thinking about ways to cover that. And then maybe like a year and a half into my time at BuzzFeed, I then took over the World account, which was dormant at the time. They basically were like, oh, here's like a dormant Instagram account with a really great handle that we don't even know how we got, at World. But does anyone want to kind of like have a try with it and see what they can do? And I was like, yeah, that would be really fun. And this was around the time that Instagram was kind of really kicking off. And so I took over the account, and at first I was just kind of experimenting with a lot of the things that I'd learned from my time kind of doing all the reporting on the ground and, all the video production that I had made that I've been doing. And so after I did that, I basically came up with the mission of the World account, and then kind of like the idea of like serving young audiences, especially young women around the world, and to like inform them about, important issues that are going on around the world. And so with that in mind, I basically started kind of testing out different ways of storytelling and using how to use kind of Instagram and visual formats to tell these stories.
Right. So you mentioned something really interesting. You were testing out a lot of different formats because there really wasn't a clear way of how to approach. So was the main focus at first on Instagram that you were doing with the World account? How big was the team? How did you approach, I mean, you got so much success in such a short period of time. So how did that even come about when you were trying to do that?
At first it was kind of really like kind of just trying out different things and seeing kind of what stuck. And so at first I would kind of look at the articles that like the BuzzFeed World team and like reporters were posting, and then kind of think about ways to like distribute them and adapt them for social media, for Instagram, because that this was a focus platform for us at the time, because we wanted to like reach more audiences and younger audiences elsewhere beyond just like Facebook and Twitter and like our website. And so at first it was just adapting those kinds of comments, but those types of content. And then I quickly realized that, there were more stories and more important stories that needed to be covered, and that maybe our team, the world team, which worked quite separately to what I was doing on the World account, did not necessarily cover, because it might not have been in their beat, because they focus more on like long-term journalism. And so I quickly became this person who was just like kind of doing everything on that account. So I kind of I look at the news and I think about the mission of like, I like to think of the World account as Humans of the World meets Teen Vogue. And so of thinking that mission and being like, okay, this is something that our audience, our young women audience needs to know. And even if, say, we're not covering it on the website, this is something that needs to be on this account because it serves the mission and it serves our audience. And so then I would think about ways to cover that. So whether it's like looking for photos, maybe it's like sourcing photos from like a viral tweet, interviewing people to do like original reporting where I would like write it out in the caption, writing the headlines, or maybe it's like shooting an explainer video, for example, with a reporter around the world and scripting that together, maybe in Japan, writing about like doing a video about the Q2 movement and having like a Japanese reporter explain the context of why this is a really big deal in Japan.
Right. And do you find that certain formats on, for example, Instagram, work better than others? For example, a video as opposed to static photos. What are some approaches that you tested that you found to be very successful, especially for newsrooms?
I think like on Instagram, obviously a story has to be visual because it's a visual platform. And so one of the biggest struggles was just kind of coming up with ways to cover things that didn't necessarily have visuals. For example, Brexit is like a really massive story that everyone kind of should know about, but it's like one of the least visual stories. And it's like little incremental things that are happening that are really difficult to illustrate, except for like politician holding a book or something like that. And so a lot of the things that I found to be really I guess worked really well on Instagram are kind of like personalities and faces. So because when you cover like a really deep and complex topics like Brexit, it's really hard for people to kind of understand how it relates to them and their lives on a personal level. So people relate to people, and so having like seeing another person's face can kind of be a way for you to kind of a way into a deeper and more complicated issue that you might not be able to understand otherwise when I just say like, oh, I don't know, Brexit. And so using like when we're short on visuals and kind of for really complex topics, we would get reporters or people on camera and kind of have them talk through this thing and as like an explainer. So that was a format that I kind of developed. And so basically the reporter, the tone would be quite like, we really tried not to kind of like preach to younger audiences. We wanted to inform but not like talk down to them, and so we wanted it to kind of feel very personal and relatable. And so it was like if you're holding a phone on your hand and you're looking at this video, it's almost like it's your friend trying to explain this thing to you, or just like telling you about this thing in a pub. That's how we like to think about it. Like, how would you tell your friend in a pub?
And, actually you mentioned explainer videos. We have an example of one of your explainer videos we wanted to show.
Great.
There's going to be a video I'm going to play for you all so you can see one of the examples she was talking about. And maybe you can talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, definitely.
For at least 50 years after unification. On June 9th, more than 1 million people held a massive protest against an extradition bill announced by Chief Executive Ted Lam. The bill would allow Chinese authorities to extradite anyone in Hong Kong with suspected crimes, including dissidents, activists, and foreign visitors to China, where courts are controlled by the ruling Communist Party. The bill is backed by the Chinese government, who approved Lam as the chief executive. Protesters see the bill as China encroaching on Hong Kong's independence and rights as a semi-autonomous region. After days of protest, Lam suspended the bill indefinitely and apologized. But she stopped short of withdrawing the bill entirely and refused to step down as protesters demanded. Protesters rejected her apology and took to the streets in even larger numbers, with 2 million out of the 7 million people in Hong Kong showing up. It set the record for the largest protest in Hong Kong's history. Protesters say they will continue demonstrating until the bill is fully withdrawn and the demands are met.
Awesome. So this was one of the clips that you sent to me that you said was one of your more prideful content that you've done. Can you tell us about the process of what it took to put this together, and the example of this explainer video, why it was so successful?
Yeah, so this video, I decided to do I made this video right around the time that the Hong Kong protests first started kicking off last year. And so it was at first, I covered obviously the protests as soon as they happened, but then they continued to happen. And so looking at kind of the comments and responses that I was getting from the audiences on the World account, I realized that, a lot of people around the world didn't actually understand the context of what was happening. And this was just a perfect example of something that is like kind of like a bigger news story that requires a more in-depth understanding of history and context in order for you to really understand why these people were kind of taking to the streets and why these protests were so significant. And so one of these formats, this was one of the formats that I developed during my time running the World account. And so to do this, basically, I wrote out a script with editors. I did my research and I did my reporting, and then I had editors check it over. And then I actually shot, directed, edited, and produced this myself. So I like set up all the cameras and stuff in the studio, and I'd like run over to the camera and then like click record and then run back and then like say my lines and a few times just in case that I messed it up, and then put it together and try to keep it really, really short and succinct, because as Instagram only has a 1 minute limit. So it was really important to like just pare it down to just like all the essential information that you could know, that you need to know in order to kind of understand this issue on a more complex, like on a deeper level.
Right. So we have a question that's come in asking, have you seen different reactions from different countries to your stories?
Yeah, all the time, actually. Basically, I guess like, sorry, I just opened the Q&A thing and I can't see. But basically, I think that like, whenever, basically from running the World account, I've had the opportunity to kind of cover so many stories from all around the world, because I really wanted to ensure that we were highlighting the diversity of the world and all the different kind of human experiences that were happening around the world. And so every time that I covered, a lot of the times when I covered kind of a specific country, I would look at the comments, and then there would be people from that country who would be like, yes, thank you so much for covering this. I'm so glad because this is a really big deal here, even if it was something that maybe didn't necessarily make it onto the mainstream media. And then sometimes, you know, after I cover like a story from like Japan, for example, as is on screen right now, like maybe somebody like, hey, like why haven't you covered like this thing? And so it was a lot of like checking DMs and kind of looking at the comments to gauge audience responses. But yeah, different countries always like to celebrate when, you know, good news from their countries made it onto the world account. And sometimes, you know, when negative news makes it on there, they're maybe not as happy. But a lot of the times people from other countries then comment and say, oh, thank you so much for sharing this. I didn't know this was happening around the world. And now I feel like I know a little bit more about this country, for example.
Awesome. And I just wanted to share with you guys, I switched the screen to show you another example that Kassy had done, which is a series of carousel photos and another very dynamic way to tell stories when you don't have video content, but actual picture content. Did you find that one did better than the other when it comes to photos or video when you're using the platform?
No, not really. I think it just really depends on the story and really thinking about what the best way of telling the story is. So sometimes it doesn't, if it's not really worth a video, then there's no real point in forcing a video out of it when, you know, no one's probably going to watch it. When it makes more sense for it to be a photo carousel post, then, you know, do a photo carousel post. Don't force a video because people don't want to see it that way. And that's not how the story should be told.
Right, right. I'm going to transition back to so you can see me, we're talking. So I want to let you guys know if you have any questions, please make sure and remind you, do them in the Q&A section. That way Kassy and I can see them and we can answer you in a timely manner. So Kassy, now that, since you've been with BuzzFeed World and this last few months with the pandemic, I feel as if social media and digital strategy has taken the forefront, and how you approach that in news, it's very timely for someone with your expertise to kind of guide everyone, whether they're in a newsroom or an independent journalist, how to approach it. Do you have any tips right now for, let's focus on newsrooms right now, what they can be doing when it comes to planning content and dealing with news for the pandemic, right? How do you approach it? What are the best strategies to approach that with an audience that we have?
I think now more than ever, kind of just because there's so much news about the pandemic and it seems to be only news about the pandemic, I think that like the role of journalists has really like, this is where you really have to kind of like test your really test your understanding of like news, your news judgment, and also like your understanding of your audience, because I think that like a lot of audiences have been feeling a lot of fatigue and kind of like information overload with like the amount of news that is out there. And it's really hard for them to kind of cut themselves away from it or understand what's important. And so it's really important to kind of really think about the audience that you are serving and the mission of your paper or your, you know, your account or anything like that, and really think about being able to distinguish between something that you should post or you shouldn't post, and really thinking about like, am I just posting this because everybody else is, or is this actually something that like my audience needs to know and that is like in line with my mission? Because the more that we overload our audiences with this information, the more they're probably going to shut off. And, you know, we want to be able to make sure that we are like providing them with the information they need without kind of making them feel very stressed out. And then also obviously like thinking about how producing content that can help people to kind of navigate this. So whether it's just like sorting through the content for them, or it's just like providing tips. Like I recently made a video for Amnesty International about how to deal with news overload. So it's just like, oh, little things like, you know, taking a break, to not taking your phone to sleep, you know, speaking to other people, just like providing those sorts of like little tips that can help people to navigate this difficult time, because obviously these are unprecedented times and I don't think a lot of people are prepared, like mentally prepared or physically prepared to like deal with this.
Right. And you're also seeing so many conspiracy theories. And I think as a journalist, trying to sort through and make sense of everything for the public, it can be very daunting, especially when you have a platform, all these different social media platforms where people are actually getting all their source of news. I know we've been talking mostly about Instagram, but I know you also did some TikTok work, and that being such a popular platform right now, especially in the past few months, what was your experience using that platform in a newsroom setting?
I've only just kind of started experimenting with TikTok. So most of the stuff that I did with TikTok was when I covered the Chinese memes before TikTok, the American TikTok kicked off. But yeah, I've only recently started kind of working on TikTok and kind of thinking about different ways that we can use TikTok to inform younger audiences, because obviously a lot of young people are on Instagram, but like even more young people are on TikTok. And so I don't really feel that, in at least from what I've seen, that newsrooms around the world have necessarily cracked it in terms of like using TikTok as an actual platform to like serve the news, because a lot of them kind of do cute things on the side, kind of like behind the scenes, but I don't think nobody really has like kind of figured out a really cool way of like using the platform to tell people the news. And so thinking about that, and kind of in line with kind of how personalities are kind of big on Instagram, I've kind of been thinking more about how that works in terms of TikTok and challenges and audience participation, and how you can use that to create a new form of storytelling.
Awesome. Yeah. So we have a question. Is she concerned that TikTok is a Chinese company and stores its data in China? Is that something you think about as a journalist, or a journalist should be thinking about when using a platform?
Yeah, I think so. But I think a lot of the times I'm really more thinking in terms of like, where our audiences are. And so, if our audiences are on, TikTok, and then if we're only trying to serve them news on like a website that they're not going to visit, if we're really trying to, serve our young people and inform them and give them the knowledge they need to go out and like change the world as they are, then, we kind of need to be where they are. And so if that is on TikTok, then we just have to figure out a way to be on there.
Right, right. And so, especially, the last few months, you've seen like a rise in Instagram Live. Instagram has all these new features that can be very exciting when you're testing them out, but also very daunting when you have a system and then you have to integrate some new format. So how would you recommend, for whether you're an independent journalist, freelancer, or in a newsroom setting, how to go about using the newer techniques or newer tools available on these platforms and doing them in a successful way?
I think a lot of what I do is just based on experimentation, just because I think experimentation is such like a cool way of like discovering new formats. And so especially when you're starting out, this is really great, because like a lot of people get really scared because they're like, oh, like, I don't know what to do. Where do I even start? But this is a really great time because, you don't really have like a following that you're like, kind of, that they like have expectations of you and the kinds of content that they will be getting from you. And so you really get to like experiment and have free reign and do all sorts of different things that you might not be able to. And so usually if if you have like established guidelines and rules and those sorts of things, then this is how you are like able to kind of come up with like new formats. And so a lot of like at the beginning of the World account, when I was running the World account, it was very much like trying out a new thing and then like looking at the data and then being like, oh wait, that did really well for some reason. I wasn't kind of expecting that to happen. And so I wonder why that is. Can I like do that again? And so trying that again, maybe with like another story, or like maybe it didn't do as well as you thought you would, and then it's like, okay, why didn't that work? That doesn't mean we don't just we stop posting it because it didn't work, but maybe we try something new. And so I think a lot of it is like experimenting, obviously like within your guidelines, but then also really looking at the data. Like the data, I can't stress this enough, like the data analysis is like so important, and it's so crucial in like informing editorial decisions. Obviously if you just chase numbers, that's not necessarily the best thing, but like using the data to kind of complement your editorial decisions can be really helpful, because you can tell when things are doing well. When you get anomalies, that's like the best part, when you're like, oh, didn't expect to gain that many followers there, I wonder what I did special that time. And then you can replicate, and then you can see if that is like a repeatable thing, and then you make hypotheses, and then you're able to like kind of come up with like new formats and make cool new content.
Oh, that's really, yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think data kind of dictates which direction you go in. So speaking about that, are there any tools or special like programs that you're using that you think are the best in your workflow when you're approaching to do content or digital content strategy?
I'm just like an old-fashioned person. I stick to old-fashioned Microsoft Excel. No, but basically, when I started running the World account, there was a bug with the account, so like none of the data was really pulling through, and so I basically just started manually. I had to like manually input all of the insights from each of the posts like every
Wow.
day, which was really crazy. But then it actually really gave me like a really good insight about like things that were working and things that weren't working. But I would say like if your accounts hopefully aren't, you know, broken like mine was back in the day, CrowdTangle is a really good one. I think that's like the Facebook provided one. Obviously, like any insights within Instagram are good. It is a little hard to access because you can only use it on your phone, but it's really helpful if you really think about metrics that are beyond just like likes and shares. Sorry, just likes and like comments. Because, you know, especially like as I found covering news on Instagram, young people really want news, and like it doesn't, a lot of people tend to think of Instagram as like this you know, positive place where you can only post positive content, but it turns out that like a lot of the breaking news and kind of heartbreaking stories are the ones that have been the most rewarding if you don't really necessarily, because if you see a heartbreaking post on Instagram, you're probably not going to like double tap and like it, but you probably want to do something, like you might want to comment, you might want to share it with your friend. And so really thinking about the different kinds of metrics that you should be looking at when depending on the story.
Right. So for example, if you have more of the heart-wrenching story, maybe your metric is not how many likes you get, but the action that people are taking from it.
Yeah,
Or,
exactly.
you know, right now, I think especially in these past few months, I think fatigue is kind of the term that is encompassing everything, whether it's Zoom fatigue, fatigue with learning, the news that's coming in about our current situation. If you're, for example, we had a question earlier about, as an independent journalist, how do we approach utilizing our social media platforms in a way that's informative, but not feeding into the fatigue and people turning off, or the audience turning off from the content, even though it's important for people to know the facts.
I think that it really depends on, you just need to like be clear to your, be true and clear to your own brand. And I think it's about kind of making sure that every piece of content that you post on, like, for example, especially on Instagram, when thinking like the user of like, say when you see a new account, when you encounter a new account on Instagram, what you're probably going to do is you're probably going to go to the profile, you're probably going to read the bio, look at the display photo, read the bio, and then you're probably going to like scroll down a little bit and see a couple of the posts that they've done, and then decide, oh, is this something that I want to subscribe to? Is this like, and so really thinking about that, because if you were scrolling and then you see a kind of haphazard post that don't really like, aren't really cohesive, then you might not necessarily click follow, because you know you're not going to be, you don't know what you're subscribing to. But if you can have a really clear mission and kind of like clear tone and voice and kind of feel to your content, then I think people will be more likely to engage with that and to want to follow you and like to be able to engage with your content.
And since we're an international community, I'm curious to get your input on, what are you seeing that's working in different parts of the world when it comes to platforms? For example, in the US as opposed to in Europe, are you seeing certain platforms that are much more successful and potential for newsrooms to be tapping into?
I think the big one that I talk about a lot is Facebook, because I think that although like the US and maybe like a lot of countries in Europe no longer really use Facebook, we tend to forget that like a lot of other countries around the world, there's a lot more countries around the world, and a lot of them use Facebook, and you know, they're really powerful kind of big communities on them, especially in like places like Southeast Asia and like even East Asia. And so I think as journalists, especially like American and kind of Western journalists, tend to have a tendency to kind of focus on Twitter, and you know, it seems to be, and let Twitter kind of govern kind of news agendas and those sorts of things. So I really think that like Facebook is somewhere that like could be, you know, more fully explored in terms of like Facebook groups. I don't think I've really seen one that is like really using the power of groups to like inform, to like tell news as well. And also I would say like TikTok obviously is like, kids around the world are starting to use that. And obviously Instagram, because I think more and more people kind of navigate away from Facebook, they're moving towards Instagram. And even though like Facebook is kind of trying to turn Facebook into Instagram, I think there's a lot of like overlap between the two platforms in terms of audience and kind of reaching more people and like the masses, because I think it's quite a small number of people that are actually on Twitter, except for like in Japan, for example, when everyone uses Twitter as their
Right.
Facebook.
Right. And so if you could recommend your top 3 platforms for like a graduating student right now who's looking to explore their presence in the journalism world when it comes to digital strategy, what would be your top 3 choices you would tell them to work on this year? And how would you tell them to strategize about that?
I would say like TikTok, Instagram, and also LinkedIn, because LinkedIn now is like I'm like seeing all these really cool posts on LinkedIn, and like I think LinkedIn is like really starting to push news and like content on LinkedIn, and I think those are like platforms that are worth exploring, because you know Twitter, we've kind of gone through the cycle multiple times, as we have for Facebook as well. But if you focus on say like Instagram, then you also kind of get your Facebook audience. And then TikTok,
Right.
obviously, because you know nobody's really figured it out yet. It's like the brand new shiny thing. So it would be cool to see that happen. But I think there's probably some kind of connection between TikTok and Instagram as well. And then you can also get Facebook. So a lot of the reasons why I work as an Instagram first approach is because if you produce content for Instagram, it's much easier to then adapt that for other platforms, versus like producing something for Twitter, for example. It's going to take a lot more effort to then kind of convert that for Instagram. And so it's, yeah.
That makes so much sense, because it's always, you want to make sure that when you're creating the content, you're creating something that can flow through all the different platforms. And you're right, starting with Instagram is probably one of the best strategies to do, because it can easily be integrated to others. So I'm going to check to see if anyone has any questions. Let me know. I can ask your questions for hours. Okay. So Kassy, what would you like to see more being done in newsrooms that are using social, like for example, with TikTok? There's so much potential in TikTok and so much potential being in Instagram. What would you like to see more being done by newsrooms?
I think, like I said earlier, I feel like on TikTok, I feel like a lot of places are kind of using it as a place to kind of promote themselves rather than their news. So I would like to see more people use TikTok to actually tell the news, instead of being like, hey, look, we're a newsroom, here's a behind the scenes video that we've done, or like, here's a cute thing that we did, which is like cute, but I don't think it's necessarily using the platform to its best advantage. And then like more audience interaction, just like all around, just like on all platforms, not just on TikTok, because I think that like there's a lot of potential to kind of integrate audience kind of comments and feedback into like governing your kind of how you cover the news. And so, for example, in the World Account, a lot of by the end of when I managed to kind of build an audience, by the end of it, a lot of people would kind of be starting to DM and like send tips and those sorts of things. And we would really find that like the posts that like a lot of people were sending us tips or like, you know, requests to cover, it would be some of our like most rewarding stories. And being able to, it was kind of like being able to hear all these voices around the world. It's like social media offers you this direct line to like listen to your audience and see what they're interested in. And so like we should really like think about ways that we can do that more and incorporate their feedback into, you know, our work and how we can best serve them.
Are there accounts that you're seeing now that are doing like their social media strategies really on point that you kind of follow? Which accounts would those be?
I think that The Guardian is doing quite good news on Instagram.
Cool.
And I really also really like Wired. I think that Wired is doing really cool stuff, and it's very like, it feels very Wired and feels very much like their brand. Another account that I just like love on the side, just like for fun, is like The Cut, and I love like how they incorporate memes into their Instagram strategy, but also manage to like, it has like its own feel and tone, and it makes sense for their brand. And so I don't mind if it's like a funny meme or something like that about like serious news, because that's what it feels like, you know, that's what they do.
Awesome. And so we had a question earlier prior to the talk. Someone had asked about they're an up and coming journalist, they just graduated, and it's very overwhelming for them to do social media strategy for themselves as a journalist and for the newsroom, and finds it difficult to kind of maneuver both. Do you have any tips on how to manage that, or get to a place where you don't get, you know, the term fatigue, but I feel like that's the word for right now.
Do you mean kind of like running your own account as well?
Running your own account and in parallel to running a news, because I think you do that very well. You manage to do the world account and you have your own personal account, and a lot of these young journalists that are coming up, they admire that and they want to know how to emulate in their own way to do something like that.
Yeah, I think it is definitely not easy because running a social media account takes time, and then having to do your own one takes even more time. But I think, again, it's really about kind of defining your own brand separate from the account that you work for. And so thinking about how you want to position yourself. So treating yourself as if you were a brand account or like a celebrity account, and being like, does this make sense for my own brand? And then being able to cross share your own content that you're producing on that account as well. I think one of the struggles that I had initially was that, like, unlike, reporters who write articles on websites, we don't necessarily have bylines when we post on social media, but there is still, I think that, like, I've just been treating Instagram kind of like Twitter. So it's like, oh, if I'm going to like retweet something that, I wrote like a tweet or something, then why don't I just do that on Twitter, on Instagram as well? Or maybe I like made this photo carousel and, I should be able to share that on my own Instagram as well. And so really thinking about like a different way of kind of promoting your own work, especially with stuff that is really in line with your own brand. And also making sure that, your presence is there and different, separate from kind of the account that you're running. So maybe photos of yourself to kind of a bit of personality as well, that like to distinguish it from like maybe like a nameless account, or like an account that doesn't necessarily have like a clear person who is running it, should I say.
So it looks like we have a question. Marius, did you want to ask Kassy the question yourself? Would you like raise your hand if you'd like to do that, or I can ask for you? Let's see. Let me find you. Okay, it looks like Marius is going to come on and ask you a question.
Awesome.
How exciting.
Great, our first audience question.
You can go ahead, Marius.
Hey, Marius, your mic is open. You can talk. You can ask Kassy the question. Or I can ask it for you. So he asked two questions.
Okay.
So first he wanted to know, is it going to disappear, the TikTok app, when new fashion is coming? Quoting fashion. What could be the strategy to follow the audience at a proper time?
I feel like TikTok, the same way that like TikTok could disappear, the same way that Instagram could disappear. So I think there's no real kind of strategy for it. You just kind of have to be on top of like, what audiences are doing, and kind of making sure that like you're following them where they are, especially when they start like kind of gaining a lot of traction, like TikTok is now. A lot of people are now like, okay, it's time to go on TikTok. But also really thinking about when you're making content to ensure that your content can live on beyond just that platform. So, if you make something for TikTok, is there another way for you to kind of adapt that quickly and efficiently for like Instagram, for Facebook and stuff like that? And making sure that you're kind of not just putting all your eggs in one basket, and kind of like maximizing the number of platforms that you can like get your content onto, so that you can, reach the most amount of people possible. And instead of just like keeping it very narrow, thinking about how you can this is a lot of what I used to do when I first joined BuzzFeed. When we were on the ground, we would be producing for multiple things at once. And so it's like, oh, this live stream, now we can cut bits from this live stream to be for this video on YouTube. And then this interview, we can chop this like little chunk from this like mini documentary, put that on social media, and we can tweet this like quote or something like that.
Right. So it sounds like when you're in a newsroom, there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of people involved. And what is that, from your experience, what was that relationship like with that newsroom, in between reporters and every person that's involved when getting a story out? How important was it to let them know, think about social media strategy? At what point did they start thinking about integrating that into their thought process of doing a story?
Oh, it's like the most important thing, but also one of the most difficult things, especially in kind of some of the bigger newsrooms where there might be some people who have been in in the newsroom for longer times, and so it's been a little harder to adapt to like kind of new technologies. But and so sometimes it can be an uphill battle trying to explain to someone who works very much primarily in print, or like maybe some another kind of focus platform, which is equally important, but
Right.
having them kind of start thinking about things in like a social mindset, because it's a win-win situation for everybody. Like if the story does well on social, then they'll probably get clicks to the website as well, but if it only does well on print, it doesn't necessarily help for social. And so we can cross promote each other, and everybody wins. And so it's a lot about communication and like writing out thought processes and workflows and communicating like all the time, just being like, this is why I'm doing this, and this is why I'm doing it. Sometimes, which may seem like really like simple, but like it really helps just to be constantly talking about it. And the more that you talk about it, the more that everyone kind of gets into the mindset and they totally understand. And then soon they're just like, hey, I'm going to go on this reporting trip. Can I like shoot some video for you, or like what should I do, like how can I like get some visuals for the story, because I also want audiences online to know about the story. And then if they know about the story, then it's going to do even better, and it's going to have even more impact and like help more people and so on.
So what do you think is one of the most important elements in content for social media? Is it the audio, the visual, the video? So is it photo, video, audio? What would be one thing that you think is there's a no-brainer, we have to have something in this medium in order to be successful with it?
I think like for most of the platforms, like visuals are just really important. So no matter what that involves, it's just like, is it like a photo? Is it like a video? Is it some kind of illustration? Maybe an infographic? So I think due to like the nature of social media platforms and kind of screens, a lot of the stuff that like people engage with like really in like really quick time spans is like social, like video and visual content. And so because to pictures tells 1,000 words or something.
Right.
And so like you kind of want to think about like how you can complement the text along with visuals. So it might be like taking a photo at something, or asking your interviewee for some like photos, or like b-roll for your videos.
Awesome. Well, Mary's had one more question. I want to make sure we ask that before we move on. He asked, what do you think about web radio? I'm guessing we could also put in podcasts in that mix, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that is really cool. But I don't think that in terms of like, I don't think I've actually, this is something that I'm really interested in, because I don't think I've really seen somewhere do like a really good job of like promoting something that lacks visuals, like just as we were talking about it. And so like podcasts do really well, and like they're really cool and people really enjoy them, especially for like commuting and when you're like walking around the house, especially during this time. And so like, I haven't really seen someone figure out like a format that like is able to kind of promote the podcast in a visual way. So I think that like there's a lot of space to be, for experimentation and coming up with kind of new formats there to promote something that is inherently not visual, and then on like visual platforms.
Awesome. Thank you, Marys, for your questions. And so you're doing work right now with a nonprofit. And so what are the differences you're seeing with nonprofit as opposed to news storytelling on digital platforms? Are you seeing differences in approach and in content in general?
I think that, I guess like working for a nonprofit, I realized that like, in news, I think that for Amnesty International anyway, it's like, we have a clear stance on things, versus like when you're working in news, it's very like, down the middle, these are the facts and stuff like that. But when it's like for, we do call out like human rights abuses when it happens. So it's more for kind of like I guess like the tone is a little different, because the brand itself is serves different purposes, and so the content that you make also kind of is serving a different purpose. And so sometimes for news it's just like, here's the information, but for like Amnesty, sometimes this content is like, here's a call to action, here's something, maybe you should sign this petition and like help this person who has been jailed wrongly.
Right. And so what do you see as the projection of digital strategy for newsrooms, journalists in this next year? What should they be thinking about, be consciously thinking about during this time? Because it's overwhelming, but a necessity for us to be able to put the right stories forward, and knowing how to do that and when to do that and which platforms as well.
That's a really difficult question. I don't know if I can predict the future. I just feel like this whole pandemic
or
is
what
really
you'd like to see, what you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to see that, like, I'd love to see newsrooms around the world kind of place audiences at the core of everything that they do, because I think there can be a tendency for places to kind of focus on, here's a good story, like, you should just like, read it because it's a good story, not necessarily like thinking about their audience and being like, is this something that our audience is genuinely interested in? And I mean, obviously there are times when it's like, yeah, they need to know about this, but really thinking about presenting in a way that appeals to them, because for example, not focusing on Instagram where young people are maybe detrimental, because, young people deserve to know the story, but instead of expecting them kind of to flock to your website, for example, going to them and being like, hey, here's the information that like you should know about. And so really thinking and like listening to the audience and putting them at the heart of everything that, you do, and all the reporting and all your decisions when it comes to, which stories to cover, which photos you choose, which platforms you focus on, how you, talk to your audiences, and your goals for the newsroom.
Awesome. So we just had Marius comment, pleasure. Mixcloud is now testing a live visual web radio, and the video content can be recorded or live also. Thanks for sharing that, Marius.
That's awesome. I'm going to check that out.
For sure. I think it was Mixcloud. Thank you for that. So what can we expect from you, Kassy, going forward? What are some things that you want to be working on or currently working on that you can tell us about?
I'm kind of just working on, obviously Amnesty International and kind of some other places. Like I'm doing some stuff for Flow, the women's health app. But I'm kind of looking to kind of do a lot more of my own reporting and continue to like build out kind of the work that I've done on the World account, and also at Quick Take, where, covering global news stories, as well as with especially focused on like human rights. And so I want to do more of that, and not just on Instagram, but also like on like TikTok, for example, and like other platforms that we've spoken a lot about in this session, and kind of come up with different ways to like, continue to like serve young audiences, because that's like a passion of mine, and to like really like empower and inspire them so that they can like continue to go out there and like institute change and feel empowered to do that.
I'm so excited to see the work that you're going to be doing, and I'm so
you.
excited to have you. I can't even believe almost an hour has gone by. I feel like
wow.
we could talk to you for hours. I don't know if anyone else has any more questions, please raise your hand or put them in the Q&A section. We're towards the end of our call or our conversation, so I want to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to talk to Kassy. Can you please share with us let everyone know your Instagram accounts, the accounts where we can see your work, so they can see more of it on their own time?
Please do, and shoot me any questions or anything like that. You can DM me, you can email me, anything you'd like.
Awesome.
I'm just typing it in the chat here, but mostly it's just at Kassy on Twitter and on Instagram, so Kassy. And yeah, feel free to like shoot me any questions or anything like that. Would love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kassy. This is amazing.
Thank you.
You're doing amazing work like always.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun.
Of course. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to share some slides with you about our future talks that are coming up. We're going to be doing every Tuesday for the month of June, new journalists that we're going to be having a conversation with. Our next talk will be taking place next Tuesday with CNN's Will Ripley, who's based in Hong Kong. We're really excited to talk to him and the world of broadcast during this time and how he's been handling that. We also have a talk with renowned National Geographic photographer, New York Times photographer, George Steinmetz. He has a book that came out in April. We're really excited to talk to him. And also very, very, very excited to talk to investigative science journalist Sonia Shah. She wrote the book Pandemic. She has a book coming out early June. Make sure to check that out and tune in with us. We can talk to her about it. And we have a few more talks coming up every Tuesday. We'll make more announcements as the time goes by, but want to make sure we come back and say thank you to Kassy for joining us and helping us kick off these first few conversations with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, we're going to be posting the tips from today that Kassy shared with us within our SBJ International community. We're going to share how you can join the International Private Group in Facebook. We'll share all that information so you can continue with us and learn about how to join the future conversations. So thank you, Kassy, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Take care.